Hello, my name is Devin Lau. I'm the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing, and very happy to have everybody here. The rare occasion that we can have the timing just right so that we can get East Coast, West Coast, and China. And I think we also have people joining us from Singapore and India, probably not Europe, or else I guess they'd be very dedicated to this. But good to see everybody. Welcome again to this event on the Asian discovery of China, how modern India and the Middle East came to understand East Asia. Special welcome to people who are joining us via RASBJ, as well as the Yale clubs throughout Asia. And this is part of a series that Yale Center Beijing has been doing with Yale University Press to highlight some of the books that are coming out of the press. And we're especially excited for today because obviously being based in China, this book is very relevant. So for those of you guys that are new here, Yale Center Beijing is Yale's only university-wide center outside of the US, and we host many programs and events such as today's to convene thought leaders from all sectors of academia, business, government, etc., to discuss the most cutting-edge, interesting, and important matters facing our world. Today, we're very grateful to be able to invite Professor Nile Green to speak about his new book, which is published by Yale University Press, called How Asia Found Herself, A Story of Intercultural Understanding. The book explores the dramatic story of cross-cultural knowledge on the world's largest continent in the century from around 1840 to 1940, when empire-based globalization caused an Asian communications revolution. And today's talk will particularly focus on China's relations with other Asian regions in the first age of modern globalization and the understanding and misunderstandings of China that emerged during that period of time. Let me introduce our speaker, and then I'll turn things over to him. Professor Nile Green is a prize-winning author and former Guggenheim Fellow with degrees from King's College, Cambridge, as well as SOAS. He holds the Ibn Khaldun Endowed Chair in World History at the University of California, Los Angeles, and was the founding director of the UCLA program on Central Asia. He serves on various editorial and advisory boards. His previous book, Bombay Islam, The Religious Economy of the West Indian Ocean, won multiple awards. And he also has two other, maybe more than two, but two that caught my attention. The Love of Strangers, What Six Muslim Students Learned in Jane Austen's London, as well as Global Islam, a short introduction. And after decades of traveling and studying the cultures that he describes, he wrote his latest book, which I mentioned, published by Yale University Press. So today we'll have Professor Nile Green talk to us, share about his book, and focus in on Asia and China. And it'll be about 30 to 40 minutes, I think, and then we'll turn things over to Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, and I'll do my best to sort of collate them and sort of have a good Q&A session at the end. And then, of course, at the end, you can also raise your hand, and I'd be happy to call on you to interact directly with Professor Green. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn things over to Professor Green.
Well, thank you so much, Devin, for that very generous introduction, and thank you again for the invitation. Hello and ni hao. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to all of you, whether in China, in Southeast Asia, Singapore, across the US or Europe, wherever you may be. Good morning, good evening. Well, today I'll be speaking then about a major part of my new book and things I've been thinking about for quite a few years now, since I made my first travels into East Asia, to Japan and to China around a decade ago. And as I was faced with my own attempts to understand and my own bafflement, really, having spent several decades traveling other parts of Asia, I began to wonder, how did other Asians in the periods I studied, the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, how did they understand East Asia? And this then brought me to the questions really that I'm looking at in my book. How was East Asia understood by people traveling from, or indeed writing in the languages of South and West Asia, which is to say, how were Japanese, and for today's purposes, Chinese, cultural and historical and linguistic traditions understood in India and the Middle East? So my core questions then. So One of the things I began with, and I think is really important to bring up in any of the discussions that we so often have now of inter-Asian understanding, is how we think about Asia. Because of course, Asia is ultimately began its conceptual life as a European concept, as an ancient Greek concept and word. It was an etic, an external concept that through a series of interactions between Europe and different regions of the continent designated Asia, this external etic term, Asia, came to be borrowed, came to be an emic term in different languages of Asia, came to be Asya in the languages of the Middle East, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, etc., came to be Yashya, of course, in Chinese, or Ajia in Japanese, or Asia in languages such as Gujarati and Bengali. And I begin my explorations in the book by really kind of setting up this journey then through a series of translations and through the beginnings of the printing in Middle Eastern and South Asian languages, and indeed the printing of not just atlases such as this Arabic atlas with the word Asia introducing the term Asia, but also a whole series of translations of geographical and works and maps into other languages. What we can see here, of course, is the famous Kunyu Wangwo Chuantu, the map of 10,000 countries of the earth, the translation of Matteo Ricci's famous map into Chinese in 1602. One of the earliest points then in which we see the term Asia moving into the Asian continent. At the western end of the continent then, somewhat later in the 18th century, we have the translation of the 17th century famous maps of Mercator, the Dutch geographer, Dutch cartographer, being translated and then printed with the beginnings of printing in the middle of the 18th century in Ottoman Istanbul. And here we see a map of Kharitay Asya, the continent of Asia. Now, it's really, however, in the 19th and the 20th century that the term Asia picks up more momentum across the continent itself, not least through what I describe as an Asian communications revolution, that through the adaptation of new forms of printing, whether from Europe or indeed through all sorts of intermediaries, we start to have then what I call an Asian-wide then public sphere, albeit one which is divided into many different linguistic channels. And one of the things I'm looking at then is not only the translation of terms such as Asia into Asian languages, but also the challenges and the opportunities that came with this new public sphere of circulating texts that were printed and mass printed, the possibilities and challenges of translation between different Asian languages, of the transmission of knowledge and intercultural, inter-Asian understanding between different regions then of that great continent being called Asia, Asya, Ajia, Yashya, etc. But let me start off before I jump into the more of the details and the case study then of what was known or what became known, understood or misunderstood about China in text printed in the Middle East and South Asia in the 19th through the first half of the 20th century. What I think is a misleading concept then, as much as we must be careful with the term Asia itself, we must be even more careful with that term, the Silk Road, which I think in many ways has dominated in the last 30 years our understanding of how we think about inter-Asian interactions. Now, as I see it, the Silk Road itself is a concept term that is part of these 19th century communicational steamship, railroad, printing press, the global and particularly Asian communication revolution of the 19th century. Because as many of you might know, the term Silk Road, or in its original German form, die Seidenstraße, in the plural, was invented by the German geologist Baron von Richthofen, who was being employed by the late Qing government to find coal deposits to make a possible railroad from Beijing to the Qing imperial provinces to the west. And from there, the term gradually was translated into other languages, particularly really only 60 years later, when Richthofen's student, the Swedish geographer and traveler Sven Hedin, wrote his famous Swedish book, Sidenvägen, in 1930, which was then translated into English and then into Japanese by the 1930s, very early, but much later into other languages of Asia, Rahi Abrisham in Persian, appearing maybe only in the 1960s or so, Tariq al-Harir in Arabic, really only appearing, as far as I can tell, in any significant way from the early 1990s, and of course, Shi Chou Ji Lu in Chinese. But this neologism, I think, gives us a misapprehension of long-term, continuous interactions via the Silk Road across Asia that have continued from the period of the Han and Roman connection across Asia. But my story actually is one of much more periods of intervals, of miscommunications and misunderstandings as much as understandings. And indeed, it's a story of interconnected ports, of understanding across a maritime public sphere, in which connections across overland, so-called Silk routes, were largely insignificant in this period that saw this explosion then of communications and understandings and accounts of China in different languages. So certainly, there's a great deal of scholarship, very valuable scholarship about the travels or suspicions about the travels of Ibn Battuta, from North Africa through the Middle East, through India, of course, to China, or indeed of the interactions between Ming China and Timurid Afghanistan and Iran in the 13th and particularly 14th century. But these connections didn't continue. The knowledge that was written in manuscripts in this period was largely unknown. It's only actually in the mid-19th century that Ibn Battuta is first printed in Arabic. It's only translated into major languages of other regions of Asia, such as Urdu of India, Pakistan, in the 1890s, and only translated and in a sense rediscovered in China, Ibn Battuta, in the 1920s. So we must be careful then about thinking of these continuities of inter-Asian connections and particularly inter-Asian understanding, whether from the ancient period of the Silk Road or the medieval period of Ibn Battuta and the Ming-Timurid interactions. So in my book, I try to locate a series of texts printed in different Middle Eastern and South Asian languages that describe China, but which are also printed and therefore publicly available, whether as books or journal or newspaper articles, then they were part of this new public sphere. And I was particularly interested in trying to find translations between different Asian languages, especially from Chinese, into the languages of India, Central Asia, or the Middle East. One of the most fascinating texts I found was this Persian text printed in Calcutta and Bombay in the 1880s and 90s, which describes in very considerable detail the Chinese Empire as was. But it was only as I began reading it slowly and gradually and trying to work out, as in a sense, its meaning, its content, a penny slowly began to drop. Could it be? Could it possibly be that this was a translation of Matteo Ricci's famous Latin account of China? And indeed it was. And as I uncovered and realized and described ultimately in detail, what this was Matteo Ricci had famously left his account of China, of Ming China, working with the Confucian scholars whose works he translated. He wrote his diaries of China in Venetian Italian dialect. They were taken by a fellow Dutch Jesuit to Europe, translated into Latin, published in Augsburg in Germany. A copy of that Latin text found its way to Mughal Delhi in the 1650s or 60s. There it was translated by an Iranian Muslim convert to Christianity, translated with Jesuit help into Persian, That manuscript perhaps circulated, perhaps was forgotten for several centuries, but was found in the 1880s and 90s by this new generation of publishers, including an Iranian exile publisher who thought in this period when Indians and Iranians were trading with Shanghai and Hong Kong and other treaty ports, that this might be a valuable commercial project to publish this book. But of course, by this point, so much of the information about China was no longer of any, as it were, contemporary commercial value. But nonetheless, this is in many ways the most detailed text up to this point that I found in a South Asian or Middle Eastern language. Another somewhat earlier text then, printed, written later, but printed earlier, was the Tarikh-i Mamlakit Chin, voluminous, 2-volume, very detailed history of the Chinese Empire. And this book was published in Calcutta in the 1840s or 1854, if I remember correctly. Its author, though, was not an Indian. He was actually an Irishman working together with various Indian scholars, presumably, for the East India Company. And what he drew together in this text were accounts of China previously written in Persian, previously written in Arabic, so those texts from the medieval Ming Timurid connections. But particularly, he drew on a series of translations of the classical Confucian canon that had by this point been made by Jesuit and by the 1840s and 50s, the new Protestant missionaries to China, such as Medhurst, who had translated the Analects of Confucius, which were also published in Calcutta, albeit in English translation, as well as the Shu Jing, the famous classic, the classic of history that had been attributed to Confucius. So through this kind of complex layering of translations then, we have what had been at this point the most detailed account of China published in an Indian language. A decade later, this Bengali text in the middle by Bandyopadhyaya, an important Bengali intellectual, the Chiner Itihasa, which literally means the history of China, but again, actually drawing not directly on Chinese language accounts, but using a series of translations into English from Chinese and then from English into Bengali. A phenomenon very familiar to translators and translation theory, known as the use of a pivot language. We do, of course, have, as signaled here in this Gujarati letter from the top right, direct, as it were, communicational links between China and India through commerce. And we also have, as found and studied by Michael O'Sullivan, now based at the European University Institute in Italy, a series of Gujarati accounts of China, some drawing on direct experience of merchants in China, some again drawing upon European translations. This is also a period through a dynamic I explore in my book, what I call the dialectic of discovery, the dialectic between projection of the self and appreciation of the other, the projection of one Asian identity or of one Asian culture, being part of an intellectual dialectic that then gradually, or sometimes immediately, brings about an appreciation of the culture of the Asian other. So I also explore then a series of Buddhist, Indian, as well as Sri Lankan Buddhist self-projections into China, such as those by the famous Sri Lankan Buddhist missionary Angarika Dharmapala, there on the left. Also the writings published in Shanghai of the famous Bengali Hindu scholar, proto-Hindu nationalist, one might say, and important early Indian sociologist, Benoy Kumar Sarkar. And his book, printed in Shanghai, describes the Chinese religion, as he calls it, Chinese religiosity, as ultimately being a form of Hinduism, a self-projection then that also came through a series of Indian Buddhist scholars, Indian scholars of Buddhism, who tried, particularly the members of the Greater India Society, founded in Calcutta in the 1920s, that tried to understand Chinese history as being a part of the history of a Buddhist Greater India. And yet the irony was that at this same period in which Chinese history is trying to be appreciated or indeed claimed as a part of Indian history, whether Hindu or Buddhist Indian history, we have, of course, famous and very distinguished Chinese scholars, such as the philosopher and educationalist Hu Shi, who at this point is writing his famous essay on the Indianization of China, in which he's claiming that it's actually the reception of Indian knowledge, particularly Buddhism, that contributed to the suppression of China's indigenous scientific, philosophical, and intellectual traditions. Great debates then about the meaning and value then, and the as it were who owned different cultures of Asia, whether Buddhism or otherwise. In trying then to find different linguistic texts then, particularly I was trying to find grammars and dictionaries or glossaries, any kind of linguistic apparatus, lexicographical apparatus, one might say, that would allow then more direct and deeper cultural exchanges of understandings of the history, religions, philosophy of different Asian regions in their own terms, in their own languages, that would, of course, then bypass the need for those pivot translations relying on French, English, Latin, German, Russian, or indeed German texts about different regions of Asia, which I found being translated in all kinds of languages, whether Japanese, Ottoman, Turkish, or Indian languages. One such example I found then was this interesting text, the Chini Zaban, as it's simply called, written here in Urdu as well as in Hindi, in the two scripts of the Hindi and Urdu major languages of northern India and what's now Pakistan. And as the author of this phrase book, rather than a dictionary per se, Narayana Prasada, he was a military surgeon working, in fact, for the British Indian Army, the colonial army, which was then, of course, partly occupying parts of China through the Boxer Rebellion. And he explains in the introduction to this book that he had compiled it because there was otherwise no book about the Chinese language written in Hindi or Urdu. And certainly there was no other book that I've managed to find to contradict his claim. But what we can see here reflected what I found in the couple of other Chinese and the few more particularly Japanese guides to Japanese and Chinese, which is the problem of the barriers of not only language, but the particularly challenging orthographic barriers of inter-Asian understanding, which is to say the challenges of different Asian writing systems. In this way, inter-Asian understanding was, in a sense, the victim of the sheer cultural, literary wealth of the Asian continent. There are quite simply far more literary traditions, far more literary languages, far more writing systems and alphabets across Asia than there are, of course, in Europe, which has 1, 2, 3 major writing systems, let's say, major alphabets. So the challenge of inter-Asian understanding then, if we want to look at this, we really need to reckon with the problem of language, but also the problem of script. And so these texts, when we do have a linguistic breakthrough, such as this language guide, it's only useful enough to be able to speak, presumably, the spoken Beijing dialect. But because the entire text is in Hindi and Urdu scripts, it wouldn't help anyone to be able to understand a single word written in Chinese. Similarly, of course, then with the language guides to spoken, but not to written Japanese. Hence, so often then the need for pivot texts and translations. Nonetheless, by the time we get to the 1920s, we do start to have, not least through the rise of new more at least improved universities in India, particularly the University of Calcutta, and attempts at the Shantinikeyan University as well, established by Rabindranath Tagore, who had traveled in China and had his works translated into Chinese, again, via pivot translations. We start to have attempts to translate Chinese texts, and indeed by attempts by Indian scholars, very successful attempts in the case of Professor Prabodh Chandra Bagchi at the University of Calcutta to learn classical Chinese and to translate Chinese text then. But again, here too, the text that Bagchi and his affiliate members of the great Indian society were interested in were translations of the Chinese Buddhist canon, or indeed translations of he was trying to understand how, as it were, Sanskrit text, Indian texts have been translated into Chinese. So again, it's this sense of an understanding of China, an appreciation of China, but which was nonetheless a part of Indian history, of Sanskrit Buddhist texts that, of course, been famously taken to China by the ancient Chinese Buddhist scholars, such as Xuanzang. But nonetheless, since Bagchi had studied Chinese in Paris in particular, his translations were more often than not made into French rather than into his own first language, Bangla or Bengali. Still, there were translations, at least I've managed to find, of Chinese texts, including the famous travelogue of Xuanzang, the great Buddhist scholar and traveler to India. And that's what we have here on the other side of the page. A translation, as it says there, nonetheless, not directly from the Chinese, but as it says on the title page, translated from the English. In this case, then, a translation, as far as I could work out, from the Reverend Beale's translation, which was itself at least partly based upon an earlier French translation. So again, inter-Asian understanding comes often through these, as it were, a series of intermediary pivot languages, pivot translations, and indeed a complex intellectual geography that is not altogether direct in many cases. I did also find then from the mid-1930s a translation, a complete translation of one of the works of the classical Confucian canon, which is to say the aforementioned classic of history, the Shu Jing. But here too, in this case then, a text translated by a university-educated Indian literary scholar, Asad Ali Anwari. In this case too, this was a translation from an English translation by a rather curious figure, Walter Gaunt Old, who was himself not a sinologist, not a scholar of China. He was in fact a member of the Theosophical Society, that great Victorian, American and Russian founded occult society that did a great deal actually by various ways to enable inter-Asian understanding and inter-Asian appreciations of different Asian cultures, as well as European and American new appreciations, particularly of Buddhism. But since Gaunt Old himself wasn't a scholar of China, he'd based his translation upon an earlier missionary translation by Medhurst, the missionary, the Protestant missionary, particularly to Singapore, in fact. So again, we have this series of pivot translations. And yet, nonetheless, of course, does this in any way necessarily devalue what we have here? Because in fact, Anwari was a very careful scholar, even though he was not a sinologist. He wrote alongside the translation into Urdu then of the Shu Jing, he accompanied his translation by a series of appendices that are around 150 or 200 pages long, in which he drew on a whole series of European language works to actually critically compare this European scholarship, and indeed to direct them towards more, as it were, inter-Asian language levels of literary appreciation. Because by the 1930s, there were a series of Indian, as well as, of course, Chinese and Japanese literary modernists who were very interested in one another's languages, one another's literatures, and one another's literary traditions. Of course, again, the famous travels to China as well as Japan of Rabindranath Tagore are the most studied example. But what was particularly interesting to me here, as I took a closer look then at this translation, was not only the uses of pivot languages, the use of English, or at least transliterations of Chinese terms into English, which would then be transliterated of Chinese and Confucian concepts and terms transliterated then into Urdu and then explained in Urdu. These attempts then to bring Chinese words into Urdu, into an Indian language, albeit via the mediation then of the Latin, the European script, the use of a pivot language then, of the attempt to create in an Indian and particularly an Indo-Islamic language, Urdu, as well as a language widely read by many Hindus still in this period, to create, as it were, a sinological lexicon, a lexicon of Chinese terms and Chinese studies, that nonetheless had to be explained in Indian cultural terms. So I won't go into detail here, but this in other texts one would find, as it were, in Middle Eastern texts too, China being explained in the terms of analogies to Hindu or Islamic theological conceptions that were the closest thing that the authors could find to Chinese Confucianist, in this case, conceptions. What also fascinated me too, particularly with the Xu Jing, was the great problem that had confronted European scholars, as well as Indian scholars, and not least Indian Muslim scholars, the great problem of the antiquity of Chinese history, particularly as expressed, of course, in the Xu Jing. And this meant then that just as European Christian and indeed Jesuit scholars in the generations after Matteo Ricci had to find a way of trying to, at least first of all, date the chronologies, provide a chronology in the European chronological system of the ancient Chinese past, but also to attempt for those Christian scholars, at least of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and indeed earlier 20th century, to try to reconcile the antiquity of the Chinese past with, of course, the biblical chronology, and particularly the biblical story of the flood. And for Muslim scholars, at least, this was on the one hand acceptable because the story of the flood and the story of Adam and Noah, Adam and Nuh in the Quran, or indeed in other Islamic languages, are there in Islamic tradition as much as in Quranic tradition, as much as they are in biblical and Christian tradition. And yet, nonetheless, no Islamic language had developed, or Islamic historians hadn't developed an equivalent dating system for ancient history, let alone ancient Chinese history, an equivalent to the BC, the before Christ system, that European Christian historians had, of course, as part of their own Christian and Judeo-Christian history. What we find then in the Xu Jing, translation into Urdu, as well as other texts written about Chinese or indeed Japanese ancient history, is the translation into Urdu, into Persian, into Arabic, into Ottoman Turkish or modern Turkish of the Christian dating system of BC, before Christ, which becomes translated then as Qabl al-Masih, for example, Qabl al-Masih becomes translated as before Christ. So in this way, we actually have in different regions of Asia, whether in India or in Egypt or in what's now Turkey or Iran or indeed Afghanistan, accounts of the Chinese and Japanese ancient past that are nonetheless using in Islamic texts the Christian dating system of Qabl al-Masih, or before Christ, BC. So again, here, not so much a pivot language, but what I've coined a phrase, I think, of pivot chronologies that are used as well, showing us then the kind of complex intellectual journeys then of inter-Asian understanding. But nonetheless, the tremendous barriers of language, of script, of trying to reconcile different theological as well as historiographical and philosophical traditions, these barriers, of course, were overcomable. They were, as it were, capable of being overcome, as of course we've seen by many distinguished inter-Asia scholars, as it were, of the second half of the 20th century and from the 19th and 20s onwards in particular, again being enabled by these inter-Asian contacts in the age of steam, print, and of course empire. One such figure, and one of the most remarkable such figures, was known in Arabic at least as Muhammad Makin, or Muhammad Makin as-Sini, Muhammad Makin from China, Muhammad Makin the Chinese. And I'm very grateful to my NYU colleagues, Fibend or Benito, to alerting me to this text. Very hard text to find now. The only copy I could find was actually the National University of Australia. But it's a truly remarkable text of inter-Asian understanding, because Muhammad Makin was actually a Hui Chinese Muslim, one of a group of Hui Chinese Muslim modernists, indeed nationalists, or patriots, who went to study from China, went to study in India, and then went to study in Egypt in the 1920s and 30s. They went to study Arabic in particular to renew themselves with the scriptural sources of their faith. But in doing so, they actually became really key and masterly inter-Asian, as it were, interpreters. In the case of Muhammad Makin, that as well as pursuing his Islamic and Arabic studies while in Cairo, he published, using his earlier education in Chinese and classical Chinese, he made a translation of what's called here in the Arabic text, the Kitab al-Hawar, the book of the Analects of Confucius. So we have here the first, as far as knowledge tells us so far, it seems, the first direct translation of the Analects of Confucius from Chinese into Arabic. And yet here too, there were still signs of that early history of the pivot language of Latin, because the name underneath then is not Kung Fu Tzu, but it's Confucius. So Confucius's name in its Latin version, which had already become by this point, by the 1930s when this text was published, that was the name by which Kung Fu Tzu had become known in Arabic as much as in Latin and European languages. There was also a translation, and not so much, well, partially a translation, a book written, a 200-page book written in Urdu, which was really a history of the Chinese Muslims, written by another Chinese Hui scholar who went to study in India, and he was studying Persian and Urdu and Arabic in India. And before he left, or just after before he left, he wrote a 200-page history of China, and particularly the Chinese Muslims, in Urdu. And we know it was written in Urdu by himself because his Urdu teachers wrote a testimonial on the front page saying that he had studied Urdu for the last 5 years, and he wrote this himself. That extraordinary figure, Badruddin Sini, as he was known in Arabic, forgive me, his name escapes me, his Chinese name escapes me, was such an extraordinary linguist that he also wrote a book, a very lengthy book of inter-Asian, Islamic, Chinese, Indian relations then in Arabic as well. He also subsequently became a Chinese diplomat to Iran in the 1930s. So it's actually then, at least as I was able to find with my own research, members of one of China's smallest communities, the Hui Muslims of China, who became the most skilled inter-Asian interpreters and indeed translators. By the 1930s, we also have translations directly from Chinese into Turkish as well, so rather by the 1940s. But these two came through a series of sometimes indirect intellectual routes. By the 1930s then, with the rise of Nazism in Germany, a series of German Jewish scholars or otherwise German anti-Nazi scholars sought refuge, of course, famously in many parts of the world. Shanghai itself, of course, gave refuge to a good many people, Jewish people in particular, fleeing the Nazis. Others, of course, went to Harbin in northern China. But a number of German scholars, and indeed a very important German sinologist, Wolfram Eberhard, sought refuge in Kemal Ataturk's modernizing Turkey of the 1930s. Eberhard was given the position of the first chair of the Chinese language and Chinese studies at Ankara University. He developed a system of transliterating Chinese into modern Turkish, and he trained a number of Chinese scholars, including Muhadere Nabi Özdemir, who then in 1946, after herself making her own journey to China, studying Chinese in China, as well as in Ankara, she made a direct translation of the Dao De Jing of Lao Tzu into modern Turkish. She subsequently also, in the early 1960s, compiled a book, Qin Xieleri, a set of translations of classical Chinese poetry into modern Turkish, again, directly from the classical Chinese. And here indeed is Hai Weiliang, whose name I'd forgotten a moment ago, Badruddin Sini or Badruddin Chini, that other great Hui Chinese scholar. And there we have on the right his book that was written and published in Urdu, describing then the history of China and the place of Chinese Muslims, and indeed the place of patriotic Chinese Muslims within the history of China across the centuries. So as I draw to my conclusions then, what I've been exploring in my book then really is the challenges of inter-Asian understanding. And indeed the challenges then for today's purposes of attempts in West Asia, the Middle East, South Asia, India, what's now Pakistan, Bangladesh, of understanding Chinese culture. Here we're dealing with what the University of Chicago scholar of Chinese Juan Soci has called the linguistic Great Wall of China. Then the challenge then of trying to access, read, and indeed translate text written in classical or modern Chinese. We're moving then outside then the one region of Asia then, in a sense, the Confucian Sinosphere of Japan, of regions of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, etc. And then when we reckon with inter-Asian understanding across the broader length of Asia, taking us all the way to Istanbul then, we find these difficulties that were nonetheless overcome through the use of pivot languages and pivot chronologies, and ultimately then through the learning then of Chinese, Japanese, or other languages then by different Asian scholars. Nonetheless, this left challenges of commensurability, of whether relying upon Christian, Islamic, theosophical, or indeed Confucian, statist, dynastic concepts in which to understand the Chinese past or indeed the Chinese present. This was the same then in other regions of Asia, whether trying to transfer knowledge of Buddhist or Taoist China, or whether of trying to explain Shinto in South Asian or Middle Eastern languages. My findings then overall then are really reckoning with and trying to confront through finding a corpus of texts that were printed in the public sphere, publicly available, that represented what we can perhaps say with some evidence that was publicly available knowledge in Asia about different regions of Asia. And they show us then the challenges of inter-Asian understanding, the limits then of Pan-Asianism, of the famous phrase then of Okakura Kazuko, uttered in 1903 in Calcutta, that Asia is one. This is a wonderful idea, but of course, in many ways, when we move from ideology to historical research, that unity was much harder, as it were, to make an intellectual, let alone a political reality. And then moving then from inter-Asian understanding, in many ways, what I found was a series of intellectual networks that were as much Eurasian across the whole mega continent then of Eurasia, as much as they were solely about Asia. I will finish there. I think I'm about on time. My allocated 40 minutes. Thank you very much for listening in and bearing with me. And I will be very glad to take questions from you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. So if people have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box or raise your hand, and I'll be happy to call on people. So we'll start with Edith.
Yeah, hi. This is kind of a very fascinating take on Pan-Asianism, which, as you say, has so often been subject to generalities. It also coincides very well with late 19th century and early 20th century history, where basically the Chinese viewed Japan as a center of translation of Western learning, and therefore took advantage of this sort of pivot language concept to reintroduce Western language and Western concepts into Chinese. So my question, though, is if anything, other than the one Muslim Hui scholar, was there any effort to sort of go in the other direction? I mean, Turkey was a modernizing force at the time, in that same time period, late 19th century and early 20th century. If you move the clock, most of your research seems concentrated in mid to late 19th century. But if you look at that modernizing period in East Asia, is there anything more to say about these interactions? You mentioned Rabindranath Tagore's book. I'm sorry to say I haven't read that, but that seems like a sort of an example of interaction coming out of the modernization drive. And so just curious if there are others.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Terry, so much for your comments and your question. So yes, absolutely. I mean, you're quite right. The period I look at in the book really is the period of, I'm primarily guided really by 1840s onwards, when we start to have printing really that takes off in the Middle East and South Asia that we don't have before then, and also bring in Afghanistan and other regions of Central Asia where printing begins in that period. And then, of course, in the mid-19th century, as explored in Christopher Reed's wonderful book, Gutenberg in China, we have a sort of a new Chinese printing revolution too, with the adoption and the adaptation of typography and lithography. So that's when I'm looking at this period, that we do have, books in the public sphere. And that's what I'm trying to look at, not just one, let's say one merchant or 5 merchants went to China and came back. Well, great, but did they spread that knowledge, that understanding to other people? So I'm trying to go beyond, let's say, often in many ways, sometimes the hackneyed figures of world history, the merchants, the Marco Polos and, the Asian equivalents, to actually look about knowledge in the public sphere. So that's the starting date. But certainly you're absolutely right with the instinct behind your question, that by the 1920s and 30s, and certainly really into the 40s too, that of course World War II, of course, enormously complicates this transmission of knowledge. At least the let's say, cooperative parts in some directions. So yeah, there's a great deal of interest between many modernists. But again, as I sort of hinted with Husserl, or indeed with Tagore, when Tagore's going to China and Japan, he's celebrating the ancient spiritual traditions of Asia that he thinks will hold Asia together in a kind of spiritual ecumenism, if you like. But when he's meeting, and this I'm drawing here on the work of various Chinese and Indian and other scholars of Tagore in China and Tagore in Japan, he often met a very hostile reception because the very literary modernists who he was meeting, and indeed in some cases young communists, were actually saying, well, no, we've had enough of you. We don't want you to come and lecture us about how great Confucianism is. We've just got rid of that in our revolution, and getting rid of the Confucianist kind of examination system, etc. And so there are cases of that, and indeed attempts to project a sort of a Sri Lankan reform Buddhism into China and Japan. And again, even local Buddhists don't want that, even those who are defending Buddhism. And of course, by the 1920s and 30s in Japan is downplaying and in many ways suppressing its own Buddhist tradition in replace of Shinto. But the various Indian scholars in particular who are turning towards an interest in Japan are interested in the Buddhist heritage tying Japan together. So again, there are often these kind of ironies and misunderstandings that are very much part of the modernists of the 1920s and 30s. Now, of course, there are many revolutionaries and political pan-Asianists or anti-imperialists, anti-colonialists who are active, and these are very well known. But these aren't the figures I'm writing about, largely because they're well known and largely because they spoke and communicated through English, or in many ways through drawing upon, let's say, Marxism, which is, of course, originally, not an Asian tradition. So in many ways, in some cases, those Marxist or anti-colonialists were managing to communicate across Asia, either by using a European language, ironically, or indeed by bringing in a kind of a revolutionary system, which would, of course, overturn Asia's traditional cultures, rather than trying to understand them. The last thing I would say is on World War II, there's actually at this point really, and particularly in Japan, at least I've managed to find more than China, because I'm only drawing upon the secondary scholarship for China, I'm not a sinologist. In Japan, actually, there's actually an imperial Japanese language school, the Tokyo Gakuko Gakko, the Tokyo School of Foreign Languages, and there during World War II, they employ an Indian scholar who actually helps the Japanese create a number of language books to learn Hindustani, Urdu, effectively, which was, of course, the language of the colonial Indian army. So in many ways, World War II blocks certain inter-Asian interactions, but it also actually enables a number of others as well, not least putting a good deal of money and resources behind language learning. It's a very long answer. I'll try to keep the next one shorter. Thank you so much.
That's okay. Joshua, go ahead.
So thanks for Professor such a good presentation. So my question is that I think many Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire have considered Chinese questions. Yeah. Well, so like Montesquieu struck at the weakness of Chinese culture and stated outright that China was by no means the beautiful ideal that Voltaire, the missionaries, and others had, extolled. Yeah. So, do you think this kind of comments have biased? Not only Montesquieu have this kind of idea, but also many other thinkers like Rousseau or the thinkers. So do you think these comments still have values today by Europeans? Okay.
Well, I think let me kind of just reflect for a moment. Yeah, this is what's kind of interesting for me here, bringing, let's say, the story of some of the Europeans. The various Europeans are in many ways the enablers of at least some of these pivot translations and these appreciations of different Asian cultures among different Asians, were themselves either in some cases critics of empire. There's some cases people such as the missionaries who had, in some cases, were actually kind of expressly forbidden for a long time by the imperial powers, for example, were themselves in many ways great critics of the political or the commercial extractions, as various of the missionaries saw it. And in other cases, particularly the theosophists, or various, actually, I look at a number of European, indeed American converts to Buddhism, and converts to Islam, as well as kind of effective European Confucianists, whether Matteo Ricci himself a kind of Confucianist Catholic. And in many ways, these kind of European appreciators, or indeed, the ultimate act of appreciation of the other is conversion, I think. These figures kind of, in many ways kind of created, I think, a sort of, representations, which in some ways were, out of step, which I think, as I understood you correctly, there were many, of course, self-critics within Asia. There were many Chinese critics, of course, in the 1920s, 30s, and onwards, of course, of traditional Chinese culture, as indeed there were in India. So in a sense, that was kind of I think some of my findings rather surprised me, that in many ways, the more of the critics of Asian culture I found were in many ways, different Asians themselves, critiquing their own traditions that were in some ways, let's say, out of step or not part of the same, let's say, idealization that we found with European or American converts, particularly, and indeed, these two were involved in a certain, let's say, misrepresentation of Buddhism. An example, I'll try to be short here, but there's a really fascinating text, and an Indian scholar has just published a book, which I haven't yet got my hands on, which is about the translations, which I talk about in my book too, of this book, what's it called? It'll come to in a moment. It's a lyrical, kind of Christianized, in a sense, history of the Buddha, The Light of Asia, of course, a very famous book by Edwin Arnold. And this book was translated into so many different languages of South Asia, reintroducing Buddhism to South Asia, a very positive picture of the Buddha. But nonetheless, this was a Buddha that was presented, as it were, the gentle, Christ-like Buddha. So again, we have these kind of very kind of strange entanglements, just at the same point as Hindu revivalists, such as Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda, in many ways the founder of modern Hinduism, if we can identify one. He's becoming very critical of Buddhism, just at the same point as actually we have this new celebration of Buddhism and the translation of either Chinese Buddhist texts, Xuanzang, into Urdu, or indeed these kind of Christianized celebrations of Buddhism in a whole series of Asian languages through the translation of The Light of Asia. So I hope that in some small measure answers your question, Joshua. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm going to jump in here since we are running out of time and synthesize a bunch of questions that I've been getting from different people. It's striking that so much of sort of, especially in the beginning, you were talking about so much of the use of pivot languages and sort of even pivot cultures, I guess. It was striking to me also that there was, I don't know if it's just based on the sources you found or what's available, there didn't seem to be as much direct sort of inter-Asian kind of translation going on. Is that, I'm just curious, like, is that a consequence of just sources that are available, limitations of, you only speak 8 languages or whatever, or is it that there has sort of, there's more to that sort of, you mentioned that Asia itself is a borrowed concept, so East Asia versus South Asia versus what we now call the Middle East, sort of how did they envision historically their relationship with each other? And is that sort of play into why there are such uses of pivot languages and cultures?
Yeah, thank you, Devin. Yeah. So yeah, that's one of the great big questions, isn't it, really? Yeah. So my answer is sort of yes and yes in a sense, that I do think there actually is something, historically, particularly of intellectual history, which I'm trying to do here. Of course, there are merchants, there are travelers, there are diplomats, there are refugees, there are political activists, or people are moving across Asia. They even more are in my period. And there are actually, kind of a lot of travelogues, and I'm very interested in the travelogues. And I talk about a lot of travelogues, which are direct firsthand accounts, firsthand knowledge, in a sense, of China, of Japan, of Southeast Asia, and indeed, firsthand Chinese accounts that scholars have written on, of Chinese in India in the 19th and 20th century, modernizers, Qing officials, kind of Chinese Buddhist pilgrims going to India, in India and Sri Lanka. But what I try to sort of trace by looking at these travelogues is, well, okay, so what's the difference between when you go to a country? Are they like when I turned up in Japan the first time? Didn't know a word of it. It's all Asia. I'm a scholar of Asia, but I might as well, okay, I exaggerate, but might as well landed culture on the moon. I couldn't speak a word, couldn't read a word. And then reading these travelogues, then there are some that learn the language to some degree. There are some then that try to what did I call it? Sort of anyway, I try to think about come up with a sort of a fancy and easy phrase, but sort of try to build upon their own experiences by then drawing upon, in some cases, European text or whatever was available in their own language, to build upon what they've observed, to understand and describe it in greater detail in their own published writings, their travelogues. So between the travelogues, let's say, and the translations, there are a range of different types of books I look at. So it's more than just pivot languages, but there's that, the difficulty between direct experience. I can wander around Japan, but if I don't speak or read the language, what meaningfully, can I, tell back to people who speak English? But I can read some books on Japan and maybe make it more, even though I'm not reading Japanese. So, there are levels of inter-Asian understanding, and there's a whole range of books accordingly. But yes, indeed, there are fewer translations, and the translations that come really start to pick up, as I mentioned, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and particularly after that, in fact, more particularly. Is it a reflection of the language I can read in the text available? Yes, indeed. But my bibliography has something like, I think, about 200 primary accounts. So I think that's, that's big enough to be, something is going on here. But really, I've written my book as much as anything to honestly say I have my great limits as a scholar. These are big projects that need more scholarship, but I've tried to sort of suggest a way that we need to find sources, empirical evidence, rather than assumptions of Asia and inter-Asia. Let's look at the nitty-gritty, the evidence, the texts. And I really do hope that other scholars will find much more interesting direct translations than I've managed to find. And if I can some way contribute and enable and encourage other scholars, then I'll be a happy man.
Yeah, that's certainly fascinating. And I think a pretty interesting note to end on, that there's a lot more work to be done, I guess, is the closing note there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I know there are a lot more questions, but I will say that we do like to take a group photo at the end. So if people, whoever is still around and wants to turn on their webcam, please feel free to do so, and we'll take a group photo here. And thank you so much for a fantastic talk. And I think, as we concluded on that last question, still a lot more scholarship can be done and to be done. Thank you guys for joining us. And I will go ahead and unmute everybody so that everybody can, you guys can all thank Professor yourselves.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining me, wherever you are in the world, and especially the large
Thank you
audience.
very much.
Thank you, Niall, for a marvelous talk.